Have you ever asked yourself why Russian literature is so depressing and morose? I certainly have. So let's talk about it. Before we get started, let's acknowledge that it's not just Russian literature that deals with heavy subjects. Reading Kafka can put you in an even deeper state than Dostoevsky, but the overall impression is that other national literature has a little bit more diversity in terms of subjects and moods, but maybe it's a bias thing. Some part of the problem comes from the internationally recognized titles and authors, and they did not choose the most lighthearted of subjects, and thus Dostoevsky becomes synonymous with Russian literature. And Dostoevsky is one of those authors that you either love or hate. There is very little in between with him, and I personally do not agree that he gets to speak for all of us. But even in the Russian-speaking world, we get this set of titles and authors that are considered classics. You get your Pushkins, your Dostoevskys, your Tolstoy, your Chekhovs, but also Goncharov, Lermontov, Gogol, the list goes on. And the most recognized titles are the building blocks of the school curriculum, and it is somewhat universal across age groups. It's very rare for a title to be added or removed, so what is considered classics is somewhat agreed on. And as you look at these titles, you see a pattern of rather tragic, miserable books with very little fun, little joy in them, even the ones they intended for younger groups. So let's look at why it might have happened. The funny reason that gets presented sometimes is that it's all because of our climate. Russia is so dark and gloomy that of course no happy stories can come from here. And let's not discount it fully. After 100 plus days with no sunshine, you might very well start entertaining thoughts about axes and old women, but it's not the source. Yes, it adds to the atmosphere for Raskolnikov to walk down a grey street of St. Petersburg and not some sunny seaside town, but that's not it. There is some truth to the fact that the themes were affected by the religious background. Dostoevsky serves as a good example here as well. His work is most affected by his religious beliefs. It's inescapable. Christian Orthodox Church is built on suffering, and through suffering coming to true faith in God. And the authors were trying to portray this Christian moral that you will get your happiness, but first, A, you need to suffer for it, and B, it's likely going to be in afterlife. And when our last hour comes, we shall meet it humbly, and there, beyond the grave, we shall say that we have suffered and wept, that our life was bitter, and God will have pity on us. And then, dear, dear uncle, we shall see the bright and beautiful life, we shall rejoice, and look back upon our sorrow here, a tender smile, and we shall rest. For Russian speakers, though, the main source of the issue comes from the aforementioned school curriculum and how these titles are not entirely age-appropriate. On this channel, I've already spoken about some of those books, but it starts very early for us. In 5th grade, we are asked to read Mumu by Turgenev. I, by some miracle, escaped it. I think I might have been sick at the time. So, our 10-year-olds are asked to read a book about a deaf-mute peasant man who, at the order of his mistress, is forced to kill his only friend, his dog Mumu. It is completely bonkers, and it sets the whole mood for the Russian lit from this point on. And yes, there is always that argument that Turgenev was trying to highlight a societal problem, how no person should really own another person in such a manner. The story is based on real-life events, after all. It talks about Turgenev's mother and a peasant man and his dog, that the dog displeased her in some way and she ordered the dog killed. Turgenev's mother was an awful woman, quite honest. And Turgenev, bless his soul, he even tries to provide us with a little hope in the end, because fictional Gerasim, having killed his dog, is now liberated from his mistress, and the story ends with him walking away from her. Real-life Gerasim continued serving his mistress until the very end. But then the question arises whether or not such a hefty moral is really appropriate for 10-year-olds, especially when the story is built on a beloved pet being killed by its owner. You can appreciate the moral, the parallels, and the depth only later on in life, but I doubt that even if I read it now, the story wouldn't be overshadowed by this dead dog. And after Mumu, you get all of these heavy-duty titles with very little breathing room in between, and so of course you would think that all the Russian lit is very depressing. The thing about literature of the 19th century, which is the main well of the Russian classics, is that all of the authors get fascinated by this character type of the superfluous man. It's an adaptation of the Byronic hero, a man who's supposedly of great wit and talent, and he's forced into society that's well beneath him, and the society that rejects him, or he rejects it in turn. The most famous example comes from Griboyedov's War from Wit, where a character comes back home to propose to a girl after years of absence and finds a society that is portrayed as superfluous or plain out stupid, and he flees in horror. The problem, though, is that these characters who are portrayed as extraordinary and more than, they don't do anything with their wits and talents. They are in constant pursuit of their destiny, of their true path. They're busy with self-reflection, but when it comes to real actions, they are rather impotent. Eugene Onegin goes even further and, out of boredom, gets on a rather destructive path and kills his own best friend. These men do not do anything to help their society, to lift them up. They just huff and puff in disdain at these uncultured masses of noblemen around them. And in opposition to them, you have this society that is less than, and they hate our superfluous man and try to get rid of him, or at least have him conform. And so he does. He either dies or leaves or conforms. And then we get a variation of this superfluous man type in the new man, which came when Russia got consumed by nihilism, and somebody like Bazarov in Turgenev's Father and Sons gets to spearhead that movement. And yet, it is the same character type in all of the things that matter. He still believes himself to be above others. He still holds a lot of disdain towards society. And even as he tries to help them, as Bazarov does, he's a doctor after all, he does it out of duty, but also almost against himself. He's not happy about it, at the very least. And in the end, he still dies, interestingly, because he was helping others. And so what does that tell us, kids? Yep, do not try. And then, when the literature trends shifted from the romanticism of the early 19th century to the realism of the mid to late 19th century, a new type emerged of the little man. He was created kind of in opposition to the romantic hero or even our superfluous man, and he was intended to bring attention to the problems and fate of an ordinary man. You see a lot of these characters in Dostoevsky and Chekhov's works, but one of the first examples comes in the form of Akakiy Akakievich in Gogol's Overcoat. The story tells us about an ordinary man, a small civil servant. He has no goals, no ambitions. He just does his job and earns his tiny salary. But he has one dream and one dream only. He dreams of a new overcoat. He imagines it in a fine detail. He dreams about it. He saves money for years to get it. And once he finally has enough and does buy it, it instantly gets stolen from him. And this puts him in such a state of despair that he gets physically ill and dies, and then his spirit haunts the streets of St. Petersburg and rips off the overcoats off of the passers-by. And the story is sad, yes. We get to feel for him, even relate to Akakiy Akakievich, because likely something like this happened to us, if not to the same extreme as it did with him. The problem, though, because the authors wanted to show how truly downtrodden this character is, they never gave him a happy ending. No matter what this character tries to achieve, a better social status, material possessions, money, even love, they always end up dying committing suicide or going crazy. And even if we assume that their ambitions and goals were faulty to begin with, that material possessions are not everything, that stalking a woman isn't love, they never get to learn that lesson. In an alternate story, they could maybe realize that the methods that they're using are not worthy or plain out wrong, and find a new approach, and maybe not get what they initially wanted, but at least get something. It's that storytelling of want versus need. Maybe they wanted to be billionaires, but what they really needed is, I don't know, to change their job and be happy with less, whatever. But here they don't. They die unfulfilled, and that leaves the audience with this aftertaste in their mouth of what's the point of really trying? Even if you try, you do not get what you want. So early 19th century gave us a protagonist who has everything and does not do anything with it and is rejected by society, and late 19th century gave us a character who does not have anything, or at least not what he wants, and he's still rejected by society. Both character types are unhappy, unfulfilled, and do not get a happy ending. And both reflect the society of that age, but it's the only story, really? You learn and grow to appreciate these books and their messaging, but it's also not an experience that you particularly enjoy. It sometimes can feel like a chore to get through all of this misery that the author put in to get to his point, which can be spectacular, but by the end of it, you're simply exhausted and just as miserable as the character within. And I think that's the crux of the issue. It's not that these books are bad and don't deserve the place on our shelves and favorites lists. There is no shelf there. Some of them are amazing pieces of literature that everybody should read, but if it's the only thing on offer, then it becomes a problem. Ironically, we run into the same problem with the more popular medium of movies. Everyone likes to down-talk the rom-coms and talk high praise to movies like Schindler's List. And Schindler's List is amazing. It has an important message and it deserved all of the awards that it got. But the conversation often deteriorates to, if your movie does not have this high drama in it, then it's not deserving our attention and praise. And that's the take that I hate, that depressive literature deals with great social conflict, and thus it is high art, and thus that's why we only know these titles today. And it's so elitist, I'm so sorry. Oh, you're not smart enough to read Dostoevsky. Trust me, I am. It's just that I cannot get through his prose. His subject matter does not resonate with me, and his style is not going to keep me around. Tragic stories are not high art simply because they're tragic. They are high art because they delve deep into the character's psyche, explore societal conflicts, and provide food for thought. But it is disingenuous to say that happy stories cannot do that. You can tell a story where your character goes through trials and tribulations and still comes out on top. It feels like we've been programmed by centuries of tragic stories to reject happy endings as if they are smaller form. They're not. It's sometimes even more difficult to write a happy ending to your story and for it to resonate with the audience. You can kill your protagonist at the end and it's gonna stick with the audience for nothing if just for the shock value. But is that the only story that you want to tell? And again, I'm not saying that these dramas are bad. They are amazing stories that push their characters to the limits and take the audience with them. What I'm fighting against is happy being less than by default. The unfortunate side effect of us treating these dramas as the only form of high art is that the happy stories get washed out of history. This video is partially inspired by another YouTube video that was done by a Russian philologist where she kind of covered the same topic, but I disagreed with her conclusion, so here we are. But in her comments section, the Russian speakers were trying to come up with the happy titles from the Russian classics, and they were struggling. And the titles they did come up with were like second to third tier of classics, just based on recognizability and public's awareness of them. For every positive book in the Russian lit, you get 10 plus more of the depressing sort. And there were obviously other stories written, sometimes even from the same authors that we consider the monoliths of the Russian literature. But the ones that were praised were these tragic, dramatic ones, and that's the ones that we now recognize and consider classics. And what it does is that it gives us this whole list of titles that have a very similar story but no alternative outcome. And that leaves a nation that has it stuck in their brains that there is no way out, fighting back is pointless, and in order to liberate yourself, you need to sacrifice everything that you love, and even that doesn't guarantee you a happy ending. What we need is different stories, happy ones, sad ones, hopeful, miserable, tragic, dramatic, comical, and for all of them to be deserving of a place on that pedestal that is literary classic. That's what we talk about with diversity in general, that different opinions provide options for people. And when you have one single voice that especially tells a very depressive story, then it just becomes the norm. And that's why we need to do better. Literature and media in general, it affects us, it forms us, it shapes us. And that's why it needs to be as diverse as possible. We need to elevate stories that provide us with hope, with happiness, that are truly enjoyable to read because of the subject matter and not in spite of it.